It is so nice to be here at Biola University, and I'm at the other school. I have a little bit of a problem, but I'm getting over it, that Biola is not only bigger in size in my print, but it comes first. But, you know, that's the kind of Christian I am. So it's great to be here. I have several things I'd love to cover in the next hour and a half. I will do my best to make sure that it's not just me talking, but I love to talk. I want to make sure that you all have a chance to interact and engage and have a chance to report back. So that's the plan. But let me give you a quick overview of what I'd love to cover for today. But before I start, very appropriate for us today is the Day of Remembrance. For those of you who are familiar with this, 1942 Executive Order, was it 9066, I think it was, right? The internment of American citizens, U.S. citizens of Japanese origin, to Manzanar and all these other places. I live in Arcadia, California. Little known fact about Arcadia, there's this great, what do you call that, a racetrack for horses, right? Little dark stain on the history of Arcadia. The horse track, the stables, is where a lot of the citizens stayed. It was sort of a transitional station. So instead of having horses, and if you've been to a stable, you know what they smell like even when the horses are gone. This is where the people stayed before they went on to their Hotel Manzanar and different places. U.S. citizens, by the way, right? So we can learn something from history. For those of us who are keeping track with what's going on in the United States, we're talking about another people group, about keeping people out, or about monitoring certain U.S. citizens. Not too much difference. I don't see a difference. So we can learn about a lot from history. So very appropriate, I think, for us to have this conference on reconciliation on a day like this. So it's a little eerie for me to be talking about all this stuff. But let me get into some of the things I'd love to talk about. This idea of sense of belonging. You may be familiar with this term. I'm going to use it in a different way today and share a little story. Talk about implicit and explicit biases. You'll get to know me a little bit better as I talk about some of these things. I'd also like to share some biblical perspectives on unity and disunity, on equity, and what maybe Scripture has to say about that might be important at a place like Biola. And then getting into sort of my area, racism in higher education, specifically Christian higher education. We can address that as well. And then I'd like to shift focus and talk about the gaps that we have in this diversity discussion and how that has led to some of my research. And I will share some of my findings in the work I've been doing the last 2 years with my research team. And hopefully it'll lead to some very practical next steps for us. I will say from the beginning that I do not have the answers. All right. Might as well just put that out there, set the bar low, right? I don't have answers. So if you're thinking that you're going to come away with answers, at least you know you won't be disappointed. But I would love to leave you all with better questions. I love the term I like to use as a faculty member, as an educator, that I love to share with you not windows, but mirrors, right? The way that you gaze upon the world, the way that you look upon the other, this window, this lens that you use, right? I want to flip it around and say, actually, it's a mirror. The reflection has to be on you. You have to do the self-work before you start inflicting good on others and trying to do some work, okay? So mirrors, not windows, and some internalizing and thinking about your own journey and good questions that you'd ask. That sound fair? And then a couple things that I'll share in groups, and then some discussions, and I have some things to break up the time. All right, let me launch into a sense of belonging with this story. Some of you are familiar with this story, R. Roosevelt Thomas and his colleague Woodruff, Building a House for Diversity. It's a book that came out, 15 years ago. I'm going to share the fable of this story. So if you want to read the book and look this up online, please go ahead. But here's the story. Once upon a time, right, there was a giraffe. And the giraffe had this beautiful house. He was an architect. Beautiful house that won these wonderful awards, right? House of the Year, right? Probably by Giraffe magazine. And it lived probably in a gated community. All the other houses were really nice. And he's working in his house, and one day he looks outside and he sees an elephant. And he says, hey, I know that elephant. We did PTA together. Our kids are in soccer. I'm going to invite him in. I think he's an architect as well. So yells out the window, The elephant is delighted, always wanted to come spend some time with this colleague, and so he comes to the door and he encounters a problem, right? The first problem is elephant can't get in the door. So the giraffe says, oh, I know the problem, right? I'll make accommodations because he's an architect. Unhinged the doors, opened it wider, elephant came in. Make yourself at home. They started talking about different things in their field. And then Mrs. Giraffe calls and says, hey, there's a phone call for you upstairs. So he goes, make yourself at home to the elephant. And he goes upstairs. Meantime, elephant tries to make himself at home, kind of walking around, walking through the halls, and realizes another problem. The halls are really narrow, right, because it's built for giraffes. Can't look out the windows because it's for long-necked giraffes. Tries to walk up the stairs, but he's too heavy. The stairs start to break, backs back, down, and then knocks over furniture because it's so narrow and small. Giraffe comes back downstairs and says, what's going on? He says, I don't know. It's, you said make myself at home. I was trying to. And the giraffe goes, I know the problem. You're too fat, right? If you lost some weight, you'd fit in here just fine. Or maybe if you took ballet lessons, right? Get light on your feet. I love having you here, and I'd love for you to keep coming back, but you kind of have to change if you're going to stay here. And the elephant, obviously, is not convinced. The elephant says, I'm not so sure that a house that's built for giraffes is good for elephants. So you kind of feel bad for the giraffe, don't you, right? I mean, the giraffe was being hospitable. The giraffe welcomed the elephant in, for crying out loud, right? Said, make yourself at home. But a fundamental problem, and this is sort of the tone that I'd love to carry out through the talk, is it's not the individual necessarily who's at fault, right? It's not that you're a bad person. You're not a bad giraffe, right? But your worldview is that of a giraffe. And all the people who may have complimented you on the structure of your building and the way it is built may be affirming by other giraffes, right? And if you're not surrounding yourself by other animals, right, then that's your perspective of the world. Right? I'll go into this a little bit more later, but this is the idea of a sense of belonging, right? Now think about your own contexts. It's always nice to start with a story like this because it kind of deflates. Some of us are here because we want to be here, some of us maybe not, but it deflates this argument about hospitality and a sense of belonging, right? That when I have these conversations with people who are in a majority group, in a dominant culture, who says, I don't understand, why can't you change, right? What is it about African American students who can't be successful? What is it about women in leadership that makes it so difficult for them, right? And that's the mirror that's the window that we're looking at, right? But if you flip it around and say, well, let's look at the mirror. Let's ask a question a different way. What is it about the institution that makes it so difficult for African Americans to succeed at this institution? What is it about the culture that makes it difficult for women to succeed, right? You shift the blame, right? And you shift the gaze away from the individual and onto a system. All right. Well, let's shift a little bit more and talk about some biases, implicit, explicit biases. And you look at me, and you, within the first 5 minutes of my interaction with you, you probably have some very easy, explicit assumptions and biases, right? What are some that come up? Handsome, good, yes? I always have to say that first, I don't know why. Okay, Asian, some form of Asian, right? Male. Anything else? That's pretty much it, right?
Socioeconomic status.
I got a suit. Looks good, yeah? Okay. All right, so those are visible, explicit, some biases, right? But what are invisible biases? Right?
Educated.
Education, right? Good. Language ability? Bilingual? Second language learner? Citizenship? Was I born in the United States? Do you know? Do you not know? We say Asian. Is it a particular flavor of Asian? Korean American, actually. You can make some assumptions that I'm here and I was invited, that I'm Christian. Some variety of Christian, perhaps, right? Presbyterian, turns out. All right. We said male, cisgendered, transgendered, straight. Those are all great topics for another time, another day, another time. I'd love to get into that. Today, and most of my work, I orient justice and diversity around race and ethnicity. Okay? You should make these distinctions. Now, other places, other campuses, other administrators have come to me at times and said, you know, Alex, you talk about social justice, but I know what you mean, but other people might misunderstand. You might be talking about certain things that are not as accepting in our society. Right? That's interesting. I'm going to come back to this idea of social justice. I like to say diversity. I like to say racial justice, to be more specific, because we've got gender, we've got ability, right? This is a beautiful building. I walked up the stairs to get in, right? I mean, that's how everybody comes in, right? You walk up the stairs. It's like normal people, right? That whole idea of what does it mean to be normal, right? Normativity for able-bodied folks, right? Another talk for another time. So these are some explicit biases that you see, and then you've got the implicit biases. You make certain assumptions, right, that come along with being Asian, right, perhaps, of being male, of being educated, right? Maybe some of you would assume that I'm pretty good at math. Maybe the math and sciences. I have a PhD. Is it in engineering, maybe, right? Was he a bio major? Maybe I know some form of martial art, right? That's Bruce Lee, for those of you who don't know. It's Kung Fu, not Taekwondo. Maybe he plays a musical instrument, right? Maybe he's good with tech, right? When I had shorter hair, I used to get the tech report, people asking for help. Tech support question, right? Hey, can you help me with this computer? I said, I can. Yeah, not my job. Implicit association, right? There's this great test. I encourage you to take it at Harvard University. You can look it up. Implicit association test, IAT. It's free. And several tests, but really, really helpful in terms of associations that you make, assumptions that you make, implicit biases that you have that you didn't know because they're implicit, right? That's what's really interesting about when you have what's seemingly a fair process for hiring or for admissions for criteria for undergraduate and graduate students, right? That it seems like it's a normal process, it's a fair and equitable process, right? But we have certain implicit assumptions. Right? So for some of you who understand this, you get this a lot. I get this a lot. They're like, hey, your English is really good, right? That's an old story. And depending on my mood, I answer differently. I say, so is yours. I can say, I've worked really, really hard, you know, because I'm Asian and I worked hard. There's many different ways that I can go, but there's always that, and it's a microaggression, actually, and I can get to that a little bit later about racial microaggressions. Other examples of implicit biases, I'll share another story from high school. And these stereotypes can be positive or negative, right? But even positive stereotypes, well, geez, Alex, isn't that a good thing that people think you're good at math, right? Isn't that a compliment that they think you're hardworking and smart, right? Well, shouldn't it be based on my own abilities, right, and not prejudged assumptions about who I am, biases, right? Always unfair. So my story in high school, I was taking calculus, AP, and I'm in this class, and I have a friend who's African American in this class, and the teacher, calculus teacher's Caucasian man, I think he mistook me for William and Henry Chan, who were twins, by the way, so I don't know how they mistook me. But you know, I got something wrong on one of the questions, and he said, I knew you understood it, right? So I got a pass, right? Same question, African-American friend of mine, much better at math than I was, right? Was always questioned by the teacher, I don't know if you should be in the AP calculus class. This might be a little bit too difficult for you. I'm not sure. These implicit biases, fundamentally a better student at math than me. He tutored me, not the other way around. But it's very interesting, isn't it, about the application. Right? Yeah. Math, music, sports, yeah, one of those may be true of me. I was actually captain of my football team. Yeah, all county, honorable mention. No, I was not homeschooled. Thank you. That's come up in the past. But this whole idea of stereotyping, this idea of implicit biases is a problem. Now, if it happened once, I could laugh it off when I was younger. If it happened twice while I was younger, it's okay. 10 times? 30 times? 1,000 times? Every day? Sometimes twice a day, right? You start to go a little crazy. And then the first time someone says it, for that person it was the first time, but me, it's the millionth time, right? My reaction's gonna be a little bit different. And so it's hard when people are like, well, what's wrong with this guy? Why is he so angry? Right? I didn't mean it that way. Why did he say this? You can start to understand the accumulative effect of what this does to certain groups in America. All right. This is always good, right? Jeremy Lin, sorry you lost him. Where is he now? Charlotte? Yeah, he's doing all right. Why Linsanity made no sense to people. And when he first came on the scene, and this is big news, even the sports reporters were having a hard time. Well, Jeremy Lin, he kind of plays like, well, he kind of plays like, and they had no reference point, right? Because they didn't have any Asian Americans in the NBA. And there are a lot of Asians who play basketball professionally, right? But not in the United States. So it's not just a white issue, right? A dominant group. If you talk about anything that's sort of a majority culture in a certain, like in basketball, for example, it's hard. Now, I guarantee you, the next Asian American dude who shows up in the NBA, they're going to say, well, you know, he kind of plays like Jeremy Lin, right? So you've got these reference points that are just so natural for us to be built in the way that we think. And I love this story because, you know, he's Asian American and he played basketball. So all these young Asian American boys now are saying, Dad, I want to be like Jeremy Lin. And their dads say, yeah, you should. You get to go to Harvard too. Right? Do that and then you can do whatever you want. All right, all kidding aside, implicit biases also have grave consequences, don't they? Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, I can go on and on and on. And this is not a new occurrence. Maybe with social media, we're much more aware of it, but this is certainly not a new occurrence. It's been going on for generations in the United States. Implicit biases, right? Assumptions that we make. You ever heard this expression, to a hammer, everything is a nail, right? I have a friend, old friend of mine who was working in the police department. He was a LA County sheriff, and from my understanding, if you're a county sheriff, your first rotation is through the prison systems, right? So 2 years, 3 years, or whatever it is that was required of being in the prison system before they let him back out into the streets, right? And his worldview shifted. Every single person he pulled over looked like a criminal. You look just like this guy who was locked up. You look just like this other guy who was in prison for rape, murder, larceny, whatever it is, right? It's hard to think quickly about something different. This whole neurocognitive science on thinking quickly and thinking slowly, right? Thinking quickly, 2 + 2, 4, right? 365 plus, 87. I don't know, I'm not good at math. You could get the answer, but it takes you a little bit longer, right? You have to think slowly versus thinking quickly, right? That whole idea of cognitive neuroscience of trying to get the brain to stop thinking quickly or to change the way you think quickly about certain people groups, right? Implicit versus explicit bias, right? So it's fascinating the things that you can learn from different fields and different disciplines to apply this. And we need it. We need it in every sphere of society. It's this ongoing challenge when we think about, and I'll talk more about this later, about individuals and their training, right, and their approaches. So I'll talk a little bit about that more later as we talk about holding on to multiple realities, about what does it mean. Alex, you sound like you're anti-cop, you're anti-police, right? Blue lives matter, right? I'm not anti, no. Some of my best friends are policemen, right? The problem is, right, can you recognize that there are good individuals? Obviously. There may be bad individuals, but they're good individuals. But the system is flawed. Can we acknowledge the system? Right? I'm using an example of police force, but we can apply it to higher education as well, which I will do, right? Are there bad people who wake up in the morning intentionally wanting to harm students of color and faculty of color? I don't think so. I don't think so. Not all. Let's be, I'm not terribly naive. There might be a few, but by and large, I don't think people wake up thinking, how am I going to hurt these people of color today in Christian higher education? But it's a system that we have to recognize. I'll get to more of that later. All right. Shifting gears here, let me give you some, what I would consider some biblical perspectives on equity, So here's a verse that I hope you will find helpful. It's found in the book of Acts, chapter 6. And let me read this for us. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenists among them complained against the Hebrews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word." Thus far, the reading of God's word. I love this passage. I became a deacon before I became an elder, and in my faith tradition, we have deacons and elders as officers, and there's always this misunderstanding that deacons' job to clean the tables and feed people and then clean the church, right? But in this passage, as I read this, if you read it carefully, right, let me just say a word about the importance of the diaconate, right? They're called to what? They're called to minister to people, right? In what context was this? Right? You've got a race problem in the early church, right? Now, if you know this passage well, contextually, right, the church is growing. It says in those days, the number of disciples was increasing. That means the church was expanding. The kingdom of God was expanding. That's a good thing. But as the kingdom of God expanded, as more people professed their faith in Christ, they came across a problem, right? And you've got the Jewish Christians who were, they were God's people. This was extended to the Gentiles, the Hellenists. And it's fascinating here that the assumption was, it's not that they were being ill-treated, they were just not being served first, right? So you had a problem. The Hellenists were saying, hey, what's going on? How come we're not being served the same way, right? Now, you got to feel bad for the Jewish Christians early on. Were they malicious in their intent? I don't think so, right? There's certain systemic assumptions. What was normal for them? Do we really extend this to the Gentiles? Or what? Well, I think we should go first. We're God's people, right? They're God's people too, but we're God's people. So that becomes a problem in the application of this. And this is where the deacons come in, which is beautiful in my understanding of the Bible, right? Deacons are there to be peacemakers, to help resolve, not just to serve the table, not just serve the food. They're supposed to address this issue. They put this on the officers of the church to address this issue. So it's not that teaching elders and pastors aren't supposed to do this. They're going to focus on the ministry of the word, but there are officers in the church who are supposed to address this issue of equity. So for people who share with me, and I've had my fair share of criticisms on different things that I've said and written, Alex, when you talk about diversity and equity and all this, isn't that a lefty, liberal agenda? Isn't that what non-Christians are supposed to do? And I said, well, how do you understand this particular passage? Right? Because we're talking to Christians. We're not talking to non-Christians. This is addressed to Christians. To take back the conversation, to take the lead on racial reconciliation and justice. I could go on. I will. So you think about a place at the table, right? This whole idea of a place at the table. And you do feel bad for the people who are being criticized because they're not bad people, right? They love the Lord, they were serving, they were sharing the gospel. But it's systemic, it's not individual. And that's part of the Western, North American culture, I would say, is that we think individualistically, and we think in this myth of meritocracy that we've worked hard and that we've earned it. The unspoken, and sometimes it's verbalized, is that if you didn't make it, that means you were not working hard. It means you were lazy, right? But to say that you worked hard and that you deserve this is to say that other people weren't working hard, right? So it's a myth of meritocracy. You were unaware and it was unintentional, right? It was unaware and unintentional. It doesn't say that they were maliciously trying to hurt other people in the church, right? And that's, I think, giving people a fair chance, right? To say, you did some things, you're a part of a system, but you were unaware of it. I think that would be fair. So let me talk a little bit more about racial justice and how it applies to this idea of sensitivity and hospitality. I'm going to use the word hospitality. I've gone back and forth. If some people are going to be critical of this idea of social justice, because it sounds like a lefty liberal, non-Christian term. I could use any word. Chocolate? Everyone likes chocolate. Sounds like a nice word. I'm going to use hospitality, and people sort of don't see it coming. But what do I mean by hospitality? I mean the same thing, right? Ultimately, the problem, if I had a problem with the word hospitality, would be it sounds like you own it. But we don't own anything, right? It's all God's. But we made the assumption that somehow we own something. So anyway, let me talk a little bit about hospitality and how I can apply that. When we think of unity, unity is central to the gospel, central to the Word of God. Past failures of the church, past failures of Christian higher education by extension, right? Part of the problem, I might argue, is if we focus primarily on, and again, this is the application of the individualistic nature, of salvation only, and we don't address other social concerns, right? At the expense of Christian unity across racial lines. Racial justice, right? That's a problem. If we say, all I need to do is get you saved, right? I know there are other problems, but this is all I care about, right? Individualistic thinking, right? It's not the whole of the gospel. We need to address it. Again, it goes back to this idea of individual versus systemic. Now, if you grew up in a Western culture, in a North American Eurocentric mentality, you get the individual, but it may be harder for you to understand the Bible, right? When you think of God and his covenant people, right? People who are maybe from Eastern traditions, who are collectivistic, right? Get systems. You get it when somebody does something wrong. It's in your people group, right? In your tribe. You feel bad. When I look at the news and I hear the story of, oh, there was a shooting. It was an Asian American. I'm like, oh no, not an Asian American. Several years ago, there was a troubled young man who, at Virginia Tech, there was a shooting on campus. And I remember that people were South Korea, in fact, very apologetic for what happened to one of their people, right? So it's interesting how that's applied, isn't it, right? That we embrace the systemic part of that. We identify with our own people, right? And I remember some news reports and some people were being interviewed saying, so what is it, the pathology of Asian Americans, that they would do that in response to some mental health issues? And I'm like, well, that's fascinating. We never say that. We never apply that to other groups, right? So if the shooter was a white male, we say he was troubled, right? There's something, it was individual. I never hear in the news that it was, what is it about white men and gun violence in movie theaters, right? We should look into this, right? We don't categorize in groups. We think of individuals, right? It's part of the natural psychology of the way that we view the world. But we otherize very quickly when we say, oh, here's another a shooting. Oh, it's an associated sort of, oh, it must be black males, it must be black women, it must be Asian men, whatever it is, right? We can group it collectivistically when we apply to others, but not when we apply it to ourselves. That's certainly something that we should explore. Why is that? What is our mentality when we think in those ways? Okay, so I mentioned about evangelism, the role of the evangelical church, and then by extension, Christian higher education. This whole idea of colorblind ideology, right? If we say, okay, Alex, you said unity. That's right. We shouldn't look at race, right? We shouldn't look at these differences. That sounds too divisive. We should be united, right? But united doesn't mean unanimous. It doesn't mean that we're all one. The problem with that, of course, is when you say, Alex, I don't see your race, right? I don't see your color. I actually see you as white, right? Not a compliment to me, right? Because I embrace well, at one point maybe it would have been, I longed to be a white guy. At one point I longed to be a black guy. I just never wanted to be an Asian guy, right? Because everything in the media and the news and my social groupings all said that is not the cool thing to be. I do thank God for K-pop, because my boys have a very different experience. People like Asian men now. They're cool. I'm late by 40 years, but anyway, the benefit for my kids. It's fascinating to me, right, this idea. I would love to study this normativity. I love this idea of white normativity, right? I'd extend this to the theology of whiteness, is a term that I've heard recently, which is fascinating to me, right? We have black theology, we have Asian theology, but what do you call the other one? That's just theology, right? That's normal. That's a sort of normative thinking to say, wait, there's not a white theology? No, that's just theology. Oh, so your theology is tantamount to biblical, and mine's always the other. It's always the elective class. It's never the core curriculum, right? So that needs to be explored. That's a lot of the research that I've been doing, looking into sort of the white normativity, interrogating and questioning and challenging long-held assumptions about the way we view the world and what normativity is. Okay, and I'll get to sort of the gap in racial reconciliation. All right, so racism in higher education. A lot in the news. There has been a lot in the news. You've got University of Misery. Lots going on out there. Those of you familiar with this story, just real quick, right? There were racial incidents on campus, had been for a long time. One student had had enough, and the student went on a hunger strike. Other students joined him. It started to get a little bit more mass appeal. There was critical mass. There was more development. Ultimately, it took what? It took the black football players on the team to say, we're not playing another game until the president resigns, right? So now it got serious. Now, and then the white students joined, and then all the other students, right? So that there was this mass protest. And what's fascinating to me is, if you know anything about critical race theory, right? This is a concept that I would apply in education. I consider myself a critical race theorist. You can be, and a Christian at the same time, yes. Critical race theorists will talk about this idea of interest convergence. Interest convergence. So as much as we like to say, oh, it took the football team to finally, everyone was on board with what was going on. Really, I think the leadership might have said, well, if football team doesn't play a game, that's millions of dollars in revenue that we're going to lose. I was at USC for years. We understand what that means to not play football. Millions of dollars in lost revenue, right? So now we're listening. What can we do, right? Ultimately, what happened was the president resigned, right? Not just the system president, the university president, the chancellor resigned as well. Fascinating turn of events, right? But can I apply another idea of interest convergence to you for a second? As much as we want to talk about the heroes of the day are these students, and we like activism, we're bringing it back from the 60s, right, of students getting involved and stuff like that. There is a cynical part of me, and yes, I could tend to be cynical at times. I think about this, and I think, well, was it really the student movement and the protests and the football team that did this? Or could it have been they didn't like the guy anyway? They didn't like the president, which happens all the time in higher education. And deans might have gotten together and like, hey, you know what, this might be our chance. Let's use this to jump on the bandwagon and get this guy out. I don't know. I didn't read too much about it, but just I know interest convergence and I understand how critical race theory works. It could make a lot more sense. Only time will tell if anything gets revealed there. So you've got incidences at University of Missouri. You've got other places, right? UCLA had this event, I think it was last fall, right? The Kanye Western, right? Students came on campus. Fascinating that they had it on campus. Right? I heard black students went to the event and said, no, you can't do this. You can't appropriate our culture like this. Right? Oh, but those are secular institutions. Right? Christian universities don't have that problem. Right? A little closer to home. Right? This is actually APU. Right? They had an event. It was, again, it's always Halloween. Not a good time to have these events. One Direction, I guess it was a spoof from Saturday Night Live. I didn't know that was still on Saturday Night Live. But One Direction, they thought it would be funny to appropriate Mexican culture, right, these young ladies. Fascinating to me that it goes on. Now, the problem is, how do you address it? I'm going to get to some of this stuff. Are these isolated incidences of individuals, bad individuals, or good individuals who made bad decisions, or is it institutional, right? We talked about Missouri. There was Yale. For those of you familiar with what happened at Yale, there was an email that went out saying, which a lot of institutions do, about Halloween and not to culturally appropriate, and somebody made a comment. There was a house guardian who said, this is, maybe we should think about free speech. And students went crazy, right? They said, how can you say that? It sounds like you're actually welcoming this kind of behavior. Anyway, Missouri president resigned. The Yale staff leader resigned. The faculty member resigned. Claremont McKenna recently had an event, right? For those of you familiar, the dean of students resigned because of a lot of the protests from the students saying this is unacceptable. There's some other behavior that are along the lines of race. But there's been pushback too, right? A lot of pushback, actually. students who are active, who are understanding rights, desiring, demanding change, and to be recognized for their humanity. And on the other side, you've got, this is a violation of academic freedom, right? Free speech, political correctness gone crazy, right? So I'm going to take this opportunity to take our first group discussion time. And you can get in groups, maybe just turn around in groups of 4 or 5, whatever works best for you, whatever is the most natural for this first round. And so I want you guys to have this discussion. On the one hand, you've got this discussion. Are students becoming too PC, too politically correct, too sensitive and less tolerant of dissenting perspectives, thus creating a culture that attacks academic freedom and the beloved First Amendment rights of free speech? Or have students' painful experience with racism finally led to this significant movement toward change in higher education? So take 5 minutes. I'll call you back in a bit and discuss in your groups, and we can report back. All right, so sounded like you had some fruitful discussion, so that was good. What did I do with my clicker? Ah. I'm going to change gears here. We're going to have another opportunity to talk a couple more in groups. But I would say that it's probably a little bit of both, right? That there is a certain amount of balance that's required when we talk about academic freedom. But academic freedom has to be applied, as my understanding as a faculty member. It's within your sphere of influence, right? You have sovereignty within your sphere to talk about your area. So if I'm a higher education professor, right, and I'm talking about race in higher education, I can do that. But I shouldn't go off on the president of the university or president of the United States, right? It may be beyond my area, right? For me, because I'm higher education, I could probably justify it to talk about the president of the university, but maybe not the president of the United States, right? So that's sort of the application of academic freedom. And it's sort of tied to tenure. If you think about the importance of having tenure, there's a great case study of that. Tenure doesn't mean as much as I thought it did before, especially not in Christian higher education, if you look at what's going on at Wheaton. Very, very interesting. Again, another talk for another time. But the realities of students' painful experiences, faculty's painful experiences, students of color and faculty of color, and how, as I shared earlier, if you heard it once, it's one thing. 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, eventually enough is enough. Or the opposite happens. The oppression is internalized, right? And we've seen that in generations of people of color, right? You internalize it to say, oh, I have very low aspirations, right? But I think they're high, right? Other people will say, well, what's your goal? Like, I don't know, I just finished high school, right? And what we do is we applaud it. We're like, that's great. High school diploma. That's excellent. Why is it that college or grad school is sort of the assumed next step for a lot of families, but it's celebrated as an extraordinary accomplishment for other groups? For which groups? It's fascinating to me. Let's explore a little bit more. I got another Bible verse here for you. I think you'll like this one. So this is in Luke 6, 43 to 46. For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its fruit. Figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor grapes picked from bramble bush. The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. I lived in Cambodia for 3 years as part of my introduction. I think you may have heard this. I was doing research there on a group of Khmer Cambodian orphans, one of several projects. I have a colleague here, Dr. Rebecca Hong, who's here. We did work together in Cambodia. It was great. In my time there, Cambodia is one of those lush countries, lots of rain, and everything grows. Everything, except for my house, right? We had this apple tree, nothing grew. And so everyone's like, hey, Alex, what's wrong with your tree? And, I kind of took it personally. So, and, my wife didn't help. She said, hey, well, how come you can't do anything about that tree? So one day I showed up, I bought it. I came with a bunch of apples, right, and tape, right? And I started putting them on the tree. And my wife said, oh, you've really lost your mind. I think we may need to go back home. Well, so it's funny, right? Because when you look from a distance, it looks pretty good. Neighbors might say, hey, Alex, you finally figured out how to get fruit to come out of that tree. But you know what's going to happen. After a few days, right, what's going to happen to those apples? They're going to rot, right? They're going to die. Why? Because it's not tied to the life source of the tree. All the nutrients and things that come out of the tree, right, it's not tied to the tree. So it looks good from a distance, but in a very short amount of time, they're going to die, right? So this whole idea of apple dangling, I would submit that institutions of higher education, Christian and secular, doesn't really make a difference. I'd submit that by and large, the work that we do in terms of diversity is a form of apple dangling. It looks good from a distance for a short period of time, but after time, what happens? After time, they die out. The initiatives fall apart. Why? Because the programs, the initiatives are not tied to the life-giving source of the tree. Right? It's not a part of the institution. We use lots of strategies. If we think about apple dangling, right? We could use threat. Threat's always a good one. We're going to sue the institution, right? Or we're going to walk out. That's one. Incentives, we've tried those, right? Let's throw money at it, right? And, but it's never long-term funding. It's never hard-lined. Guilt, oh, we're good at that. Christian institutions, right? We'll make people feel bad, right? None of those strategies actually are long-term solutions, right? Because we're talking about behaviors. We're not talking about consciousness, right? Because out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? If it's not tied to the heart of the institution, there won't be change. I love this idea of confessional versus functional theology. Are you familiar with that? What you confess, you say you believe, versus I could tell by the way you act what you really believe, right? And that's how I think of a lot of institutions. Every president at every institution, secular, Christian, and everything in between, will say diversity is important. It's one of my important initiatives at my institution. Part of our mission, part of our long-term, absolutely. I don't know a president who doesn't say that, right? But you can tell a tree by its fruit. You can tell a tree by its fruit. Let me jump in one here. Daryl Smith, faculty colleague, recently retired. She's at Claremont Graduate University. Wrote this book called Diversity's Promise for Higher Education. The point I wanted to make here in one of the arguments that she makes is this idea of technology, right? 10, 15, 20 years ago, when technology, the internet first came out, right? They didn't know what they were supposed to do with this, right? They just knew we didn't know it was going to be the game changer it was. At the time that the internet started to come out, and email, electronic mail, and all this other stuff, this is way before Facebook, when it started coming, what did the universities do across the country? What did they do? Did they hire one department? Did they create a department to talk about technology? Did they hire just one chief information officer to say, yeah, we're going to address this idea of technology? No. The entire university changed, right? The residence halls were, at the time, they were wired with T1 lines, right? And now they're wireless, right? The institutions knew that we had to keep up. I didn't care if it was a bad year economically, right? We had to keep up. Because if we didn't, we wouldn't survive. They saw the value of this, right? Of this, what technology was important. Every university leader would say, technology is important. And they did something about it. Diversity is important. He said the same thing, but we didn't do anything about it. We did the opposite. We hired a diversity coordinator, right? We got a chief diversity officer. Oh, look, this person's over here, right? I've talked to that person. It's always this kind of, well, I've consulted with the chief diversity officer, and he or she said it would be okay. I'm like, we do that all the time. I get that all the time, and I actually do that all the time, right? When people say, Alex, I said this line, that's not racist, was it? And I said, no, you are forgiven. You go on your way. You are okay. I will speak for all people of color. You're going to be all right. Well, I do that too on gender. I found myself going to female colleagues and saying, I said this thing the other, was that sexist? That wasn't sexist, right? Please tell me that wasn't sexist, right? Because I want to be down. I want to, with you guys, because I teach this stuff. I better be. And it's the same thing, right? It's that whole mentality of looking to a scapegoat, one person who's going to answer the question in diversity, versus you have an entire system that changed, right? And it wasn't because we didn't have money, right? In the worst economic crisis of for our generation, universities continued to take care of technology issues. There wasn't a single, oh, we don't have money, we can't do anything. We're not going to have internet. I've never heard that. But I sure hear that a lot with diversity. They're like, we don't have money. Enrollment's down, blah, 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 all this. It's always the value, not the money itself, that you have to consider. So that's the heart of the institution. I'm going to go back to this other example that I didn't share earlier about Texas A&M, right? That was recently in the news. A group of students of color, high school students, were coming on campus, and there were racially tinged comments saying, go back home, go back from where you came from. And it's interesting to me because this is, I could copy and paste this almost for every leader who comes out and makes a statement, right, and says, I am shocked and appalled. I am outraged and disappointed. This does not represent the mission and values of our institution. I mean, every single time I hear that, right? Fascinating to me. Well, let's move a little bit forward, and I'll try to tie these two in together, right? Most recently, there was an apology, right, in the president, which is the right thing to do, and hopefully the apology was accepted, which is also the right thing to do. These actions of a few, this is sort of paraphrasing here, the actions of a few do not represent our institution's missions and values. I would argue that they actually do, right? Because on the one hand, at best, it's an institution that doesn't regulate and check or educate a lot of the activities that go on, this type of behavior, at best. At worst, we actually encourage it. We're breeding it, right? We're cultivating that culture. And by extension, we are making this, we're extenuating this, we're making it much worse, we're perpetuating this issue, right? A few bad apples, is that what it is? Just a few bad apples, right? Or, shall we, again, from windows to mirrors, right? Let's not look at the few bad apples. Let's look at the branches. Let's look at the tree. Let's look at the roots. Let's look at the soil. And we wonder where this comes from. Right? All right, so we've covered stuff on hospitality. I've talked about sense of belonging, implicit biases, covered some. Microaggressions, right? We know the difference between, I'll explain what microaggressions are in a second. Cultural appropriation we talked about. And then, of course, I'm going to share some challenges that I've heard over the years. And maybe you've heard some as well. Challenges to this idea of diversity. Microaggressions, let me give you a brief definition. Daryl Wing Su and his colleagues said it this way for racial microaggressions. Brief and commonplace, daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults toward people of a non-dominant group. They're micro because they're small, right? What's the difference between a microaggression and a macroaggression then, right? A macroaggression would be somebody shot and killed another black boy in the streets. The microaggression is, why are you always getting upset about these things? Well, maybe he deserved it, right? Micro, macro, right? But in the context of higher education, this happens all the time. In comments, as I shared earlier, Alex, your English is really good, right? If you say to certain groups of people, they say, you're very articulate, right? And the hidden meaning behind that is, you surprise me. I didn't think you would be as articulate as you are, right? Or you're well-mannered. I mean, these are comments that you hear for certain groups of color, right, on a regular basis, right? So these are examples of microaggressions. Happens in classes all the time. Last fall, I had an opportunity to address my university faculty colleagues, and one of the topics we addressed was microaggressions. That it happens all the time. You hear these reports from students about satisfaction on campus, right? And they say, I have a problem with microaggression. And then there's this position of power that faculty members have, that when they say it, then they have all the authority and the power. The student feels powerless right? And we wonder why students leave. We wonder why students of color leave. They're like, well, you left because of that? I mean, gosh, the students really are too sensitive, right? They're being coddled. You need to be stronger. We blame the students. We don't blame the institutions, the culture of the institutions that continue to perpetuate these things. All right, common challenges. These are over the years that I've heard. Maybe for those of you who are engaged in some of this work, you've heard this as well. So microaggressions, well, I didn't mean it like that, right? That was not my intent. And it's not who I am. I've heard that. And you're being too sensitive, right? Let me take those three for a second and just say this whole idea, about critical race theory, this idea of intent versus impact. Intent versus impact. What your intentions were mean very little to the impact that it has for me, right? So I was traveling recently on a plane, and the overhead bins, people carry way too much stuff, way too heavy in the overhead bin. And if you can't carry it, don't bring it. Anyway, the person brought this and tried to put it up and couldn't, and it fell on me, right? Ouch! And the person said, the person looked at me. And now if that person's response was, you know what, you were kind of in the way. It's me, it's partially your fault, right? Like, no, that's not appropriate. That's not an appropriate response. Well, I didn't mean to do it, right? Like, your intentions have nothing to do with my bruised shoulder right now, right? What you need to say is, I'm sorry. You have to acknowledge the impact and not focus on the intent, right? Because if we focus on the intent, what does that do? That minimizes the impact. We're like, oh, well, I'm a good person. I'm not racist, right? Well, I don't care if you're racist or not. I'm not trying to get to the ontological reasoning of your existence and your humanity. I'm trying to address the act that you did, right? Jay Smoot has this great video, if you haven't seen it, this idea of if somebody steals my wallet, I'm not trying to figure out if that person in his core is unkind. I just want my wallet back, right? So you address the issue, right? The impact and not the intent that you have to address. Okay, so I didn't mean it's not who I am are not good excuses for getting to the impact. And if you've done something wrong, you step on somebody's toe, you acknowledge it. You say, I'm sorry, right? I get that a lot at home with my wife, right? If I turn the tables and try to say, well, that's not who I am, that's not my intent, I end up sleeping on the couch more often than not. Okay, you're too sensitive. That's a common one we've talked about. Reverse racism. Have you heard this expression of reverse racism, right? The idea that if an individual, well, black people can be racist too, right? Asians are racist, or I live in Arcadia, a lot of Asians in Arcadia. Is that racism? One definition, sort of an operational definition of racism, if you use a system as opposed to individual, right? And you multiply that by power, because it's power and privilege, right? That's how you have a system. Anytime you use this idea of racism, ISM, right? If you learned in 8th grade English, maybe earlier, right? It's talking about a system, right? Capitalism. It's an idea. It's a concept. So racism would be a systemic concept, right? That individuals might actually be prejudiced, but it's hard to say that they're racist, right? Because racism is being used in a systemic way. Right? So, classic argument again, I have some more of these points where somebody would say, well, I never owned slaves, and I've never called anyone this word, right? Again, it's the individualistic mindset as opposed to the systemic that they haven't been able to embrace, right? Never mind the fact that they've benefited over the years, right? Generational wealth and other things, right? Assuming everybody worked hard. So reverse racism doesn't really make sense. Can you be a majority minority? Same idea. Right? That by 2042, right, this idea that non-whites are going to be the majority, right? That makes the assumption, as Harry Kondabolu says, right? The assumption is that non-white simply means everyone's the same. They're just non-white, right? Koreans and blacks historically have not gotten along, but to simply say that you're non-white, that means you're going to be in the majority, right? Lumps a whole group of non-whites together, which doesn't make sense either. And again, these are political terms, right? And power and systems. Okay, white guilt. Alex, you win. All right, I feel guilty. Right? Are you happy now? Right? Now what? Again, the problem with that, white guilt, right? You've internalized a certain part of this. I mean, there's part of the journey of self-work, which I understand, right? But it's, again, you're still thinking about the individual, right? You're not looking at a system. Like, I've done sexist things, I've said sexist things, right? My feeling guilty about that, mansplaining things all the time, right, doesn't resolve the problem. I need to engage in this conversation. I need to do more, not with other women, I need to do it with other men, right? I need to recognize that when a bunch of dudes are together, right, and things come up, my silence, I'm complicit in the problem, right? And the same thing would be true in your own affinity groups. When there's not a person of color in the room, you kind of look and you're like, hey, I got a good joke. Let me tell you this one, right? Who's going to call you out? Well, there's no person of color in the room to call you out. Somebody's got to do it in the group, right? It's collective, it's systemic, it's not individualistic. I talked about this one already. I don't see color, right? To say that you don't see color means that everyone should be a dominant majority group, and that's problematic. Why do you keep talking about the past? Slavery was a long time ago. Why do you keep talking about civil rights? I'm going through that right now with my denomination, that we tried to have an overture on public apology and recognition of our inability to engage in civil rights at the time. And this is the Presbyterian Church. And a lot of pushback. Like, you keep harping on the past, right? Let's think about the now. Let's look at the future. The reality is, we look at the past all the time, don't we? July 4th, Thanksgiving. We got all these events that we have. It's not like we don't look at the past. 9/11, right? We look at the past. If it's convenient for us, we celebrate it, right? We got to change our mindset, friends. We got to think about these. We've been doing it, but then when it's not convenient for us and it's painful, we say, oh, no, let's not talk about the past, right? Well, then stop celebrating July 4th. I feel so bad for the British. I just gosh, give them a break. You kidding? All right. The more you bring this up, the more it becomes a problem. Stop talking about this all the time. That's why it's bringing it to people's consciousness. Tim Wise had a great response to this, right? He said, if I stop talking about poverty, does poverty go away? Right? If I stop talking about world hunger, does world hunger go? No, it doesn't. You have to continue to engage in this conversation, right? Because you have to stay vigilant, you have to stay in conversation and discussion to have these ongoing discussions. Hopefully we can do it in a very constructive, winsome way. Which brings me to this last point. If you would be less angry, then maybe I can hear what you have to say better. Now this is an interesting one. I don't consider myself an angry Asian man. That's Phil Yu's job. Look up angryasianman.com. Great website. He's been doing this for 15 years. I'm smiling when I talk, right? Happy? Yes? Peace? This whole idea of, like, I don't like the way you say it. Again, it goes back to, well, on one hand, Robin DiAngelo would say this is white fragility, right? That I get to dictate how it's told to me. This idea of safe space, right? Well, I need safe space. Safe space for whom, right? Because if it's an opportunity for people of color to finally talk to a majority group to say, this is what's been bothering me and us for a long time. It's like, oh, I feel threatened. I don't feel safe. Well, now look who's being sensitive. Now who's being coddled, right? This idea of you get to dictate not only what's said, but how it's said, right? James Baldwin had this great quote about, if my hand was touching a fire pan and it was hot and I took it off, I'm going to be hot. I'm going to be riled up because I'm experiencing the sensation of pain, right? But to say that you reframe this like what happened with the Ferguson riots in Baltimore, like, hey, stop destroying property, right? Let's take a civil approach to this conversation. Now, I'm not advocating violence, right? But I understand. But to say your focus is on property damage, right? When we're talking about the death of a child, right? And you're worried about the property damage, it really helps me understand what's important, right? And it's that reframing that we need to do when we talk about anger and responsiveness. Okay, one more group discussion. When we talk about institution, now we're in different groups. We could be mixed groups or different groups. We can stay in our same groups here, but your institution, think about this. What signals does your institution send that remind students that they don't have a place at the table? And if you get to this, what hospitality practices will lead to a greater sense of belonging. So I'll give you some time. Go back to your same groups. And if you can get whichever question you want to go to first, go right ahead. Conversations, when we think about race, is signals that are sent is it's always the people of color who are engaged in issues surrounding people of color, right? So there's a point that I like to say is, as I mentioned earlier about gender and men, for me, not having women to have these conversations, but men to have these conversations with other men is going to be equally important, right? I like this little MTV video because the danger is then for me to co-opt the conversation, for me to mansplain it and jump in and take over the conversation. This is certainly true for people of color. You need dominant majority people to engage in conversations, not with or for other people of color, but you need to have it with your own groups, right? In other words, don't wait for diversity and social justice and racial justice conversations to happen when a person of color comes in the room. It should be happening regularly. I mean, that's part of the challenge. If I jump to sort of hospitality practices that lead to this, right? I'm always surprised when I find out that people have had this conversation, faculty colleagues of mine, and I think, who was in the room? And they say, oh, it's so-and-so and so-and-so. And I'm like, well, they were all white people. That's all right. That's pretty good. You had it without me, right? Which is good, right? It's that idea that these conversations are happening, that it's organic and it's not just with people of color, I think is going to be an important point that I wanted to drive home. It's critical, in fact, for us to have these conversations in our own spheres, in our own groups. Okay. Moving on here, part of the challenge for me, as I think about racial reconciliation, it's by whom, as I mentioned, right? Is it people of color who do this, and for whom? Right? When I teach a diversity class, it's always funny because the people of color in the room, myself included, sometimes the class ends up being primarily for the white students in the class to sort of get this, right, to understand it. Not always. So when we talk about racial reconciliation, we're talking about it not just for the people of color, it's for the dominant majority group. So if you're a person of color and you've been sitting here listening to me talking about this stuff, and I'm going to start talking about sort of the role of white evangelicals as part of my research, you think, well, haven't we done enough research on like white people? As I said earlier about the theology of whiteness, right? We need to interrogate and look deeper into some of the cultural realities and the ontological and epistemological assumptions of a dominant majority group, which is, for me, fascinating. Part of the problem, as I've done research over the years on students of color, success, mobility, and all these types of things, it's always on people of color, with people of color, for people of color, right? And that's diversity. When we think of gender, I think, oh, it's a women's issue, right? Yeah, gender's not a woman, it's male and female, cis and trans. But when we talk about gender, I just assume it's a woman's issue, right? That's how I mansplain things. I'm naturally wired that way. When we talk about diversity, we think, oh, it's people of color, right? When it's actually everybody's. So this is a concern for us to address in the majority group, and that's why I do what I do. So my research focuses on the experiences of white administrators at Christian institutions, faith-based institutions of higher education, who have demonstrated a commitment to anti-racism. It's not just an awareness, and I'm going to talk about awareness in a minute, but it's a commitment to anti-racism. And what does that mean in particular? I hope I made sense on why do I study white people? Why do I study white people? Okay. My research question is here, looking at what characterizes these experiences of individuals, really that captures the work that they do that led to them to choose to engage in this work. And I do say choose to, right? Because this is part of the privilege that is prevalent in a dominant culture, right? If I talk about gender and I talk about women's issues and men's issues, I can choose to engage in that. But if I choose not to, I go home and I'm still a guy and I don't have to think about it, right? That's the very definition of privilege. Right? So to engage in this, to choose to and recognize that this is something that you're doing. All right. Narrative inquiry, I interviewed a lot of people, talked to them. I used this grounded theories approach to come up with this conceptual model that I'm going to share with you. Across the country, northwest, southeast in the United States, my research team of doctoral students At APU, we've expanded our work. We're going to Canada and we're going to Australia. We want to look at whiteness in a different context, comparatively. So those studies are coming. We relied a lot in our recruitment of asking other individuals to say, do you know of somebody who fit this definition? Action-oriented strategy for institutional systemic change, as you can see here, for social oppression, right? Oh, you got to talk to this guy, this person. You have to talk to this woman. And so that was our nomination process, right? So you can't call yourself an ally, by the way, right? It doesn't work that way. I think it's a badge of honor that is earned, right? I can't say that I am an ally for someone. People need to say that about me, if they say it at all, right? So self-nominations, it's not like the who's who, right? You can't just nominate yourself and then sort of put that on your resume. So we asked others who would engage in this. So that was the part of our challenge of doing this work. So we got over 40 people that we've interviewed over the last year and a half, 2 years. 2 theoretical models that have emerged. One is this idea of a cycle of critical consciousness, and the other is a continuum, awareness and engagement, continuum. The cycle of critical consciousness really started with an activator. It could have been a person, it could have been an event, right? A light bulb moment, if you will, that someone finally, I get it, I understand now, right? Oh, this is what people have been telling me all this time. I finally understand it. It's never that one isolated moment, though, right? It's not one particular moment and now I get it, right? That activating moment led to this awakening that led to an awareness. That awareness then moves to, how do I do this? Okay. The awareness then led to actions. So let's say somebody wasn't engaged in work at all. They finally understand. They got it. The light bulb went on. And someone said, I should go talk to people and educate myself. It's the self-work journey. I'm going to go to Black Student Union. I'm going to meet with some students. Not to take over the group, but I want to learn. That's an alliance, right? What we're calling an alliance. That you're building these relationships. You're not really an advocate necessarily yet, right? It's a deeper level. That alliance leads to greater awareness, right? So somebody goes and says, I think it's a good idea. Now I get it. I need to go to this rally. I should go protest. And I don't know why I was there, though, because people challenged me on why I was here, and I felt so bad. Deeper awareness. That cycle just goes deeper and deeper, right? That leads to advocacy. I don't think they would necessarily, none of the participants ever define themselves as advocates. Again, the nominations process, others would say, I see you as an advocate. I see you as my ally, right? That then leads to more action, which leads to greater awareness. So that's the cycle. That's critical consciousness, right? It's never a single moment necessarily. It's an accumulation of moments that perhaps led to this. I think what's fascinating part of this process that's come up, and I've heard this time and again with white allies, is there comes a moment, it's almost like a litmus test, that a person of color finally felt comfortable enough to challenge them to say, you said some things that hurt me. And they were devastated by that because they thought they were an ally. And this whole idea of, you're finally, people trust you. This is a good thing, right? That somebody's sharing with you. That old Jerry Maguire scene with Cuba Gooding Jr., he's like, I'm sick of arguing with you. You think we're arguing, we're finally communicating, right? That whole idea of trust, that someone's let you into their circle to tell you how they've been hurt by you is fascinating. All right, so the critical consciousness model then led to this other model that we're calling the awareness engagement model. And as you can see here, 4 quadrants essentially. You've got the aware and unengaged, right? So people who maybe took a class, a little more awareness, understand what's going on, but haven't done anything about it, right? Ultimately, you want to get to this quadrant here, aware and engaged, but what does that really mean? It's sort of an elusive, no one can ever say that they've arrived. But then one thing you can say is that there are people in this group category here of unaware and unengaged. I didn't know, and I didn't know that I didn't know, and I haven't done anything about it. But if there ever is the most dangerous group, it would be the unaware and engaged, right? Some would argue. It's like, you know what, you're not helping. You're doing stuff, but that's actually not helping, it's hurting, right? If I took this model of unaware yet engaged, it falls somewhere in here, right? It's not a clear picture, but if you were to say, I'm doing stuff, but in that doing, and I might have hurt some people while I'm doing it, it led to greater awareness. I mean, I can understand that when you think of service learning, right? Who's the service for and who's the learning for? It's really for you. You're not really helping the community as much as you are helping yourself understand some of this stuff. So that's sort of where I am with this awareness engagement model. 2 articles that are coming out for publication. One has been submitted to Diversity Issues in Higher Education, which is a secular academic journal. The other one is Christian Higher Education, which is housed at APU, actually. But those are the 2 journals that are going to come out with some of our work. We've got other publications coming out in the near future. I'm going to skip the group discussions and then share this final story for you. Anytime that you have an event, there will always be 2 perspectives. Right? So, final story. There was a teacher teaching in inner city, and most of the students were students of color. It's a Caucasian teacher. Wanted to share a story of culture and said, hey, you know the story of the early bird gets the worm? I'm like, yeah. Okay, so one young man of color raises his hand and goes, okay, I know what it means. Okay, what is it? It means that you stay in bed as long as you can and you never get up. And he said, no, the teacher said, no, it's the opposite of that. Why would you say that? And the young student said, because if you wake up early, the bird will eat you. Now you see what happened? The student identified with the worm, right? The non-dominant. Now by and large, our thinking is always from a dominant framework. It's natural for us to think in those terms, right? And it's this work that we're doing that all of you are engaged in and that I've been doing, it's trying to change perspective, trying to get people to understand from the other side, right? It's one of the greatest gifts of communication is your ability to listen and learn, empathy, right? So I want to leave you with that thought that 2 perspectives on any given event, probably multiple perspectives as you go forward. And thank you so much for your time. One final plug, if I can. It's if you're on Facebook at all, which I am, there's Race and Justice in Higher Education, if you're interested in this. So you can go on Facebook and go to Race and Justice. I also have a rjhe.org, Race and Justice in Higher Education. You can check us out there.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.